There is an archive in Mexico City that has been waiting for 300 years for someone to read it carefully enough. It's not hidden, it's not sealed, it's cataloged, accessible, and can be consulted by any researcher with credentials from the National Archives. No one burned it, no one censored it, no one buried it under tons of ecclesiastical bureaucracy. It has simply been in a state that archivists call no significant demand for consultation for centuries. Which means, in the plain language this fact deserves, that no one has been interested enough to read it carefully. This archive contains the pharmacy inventories of the hospitals that the Order of St. John of God established in New Spain between the 16th and 18th centuries. Hospitals in Mexico City, Puebla, Oaxaca, Guadalajara, Guatemala, and Lima. Detailed inventories, compiled by nurses and apothecaries who knew exactly what they had on their shelves and what they used it for. And in these inventories, alongside the plants that appear in the authoritative medical treatises of the time, Andrés Lagunas Dioscórides, the texts of Juan de Cárdenas, the surgical manuals of Alonso López de Hinojosos, others appear. Plants without Latin names. Plants with Nahuatl names, sometimes with Totonac or Zapotec names clumsily transliterated into Spanish. Plants that no university-trained physician in 17th century Spain would have recognized. Plants that the friar nurses knew because they had been taught by the indigenous healers they hired as hospital assistants, whom they paid with house, food, and a modest remuneration, and whose knowledge they absorbed with a pragmaticity that no theological treatise would have approved if anyone had bothered to read them carefully. 5 of these plants are at the heart of what we're going to talk about today. 5 plants documented in the Royal Hospital Archives of New Spain, each with a name, a use, a history of silence, and, in several cases, a contemporary scientific life that confirms what the friars noted 400 years ago. 5 plants that the Brothers of St. John of God cultivated in their gardens, prepared in their pharmacies, administered to their patients, and never mentioned in official medical literature, not out of ignorance, but due to a combination of institutional prudence and concrete, documentable fear. In this case, fear had a name, a headquarters, and jurisdiction. It was called the Holy Office of the Inquisition. It had tribunals in Mexico City, Cartagena de Indias, and Lima. And among its responsibilities was the oversight of any practice that could be considered idolatrous, superstitious, or contrary to the faith. Using plants that indigenous people had employed in religious rituals, even if the plant was now used in a purely medical context, without invocations or ceremonies, could lead to a denunciation. Not necessarily a conviction, but certainly an investigation. And an investigation by the Holy Office was enough to ruin a hospital's reputation, cut off its donations, and jeopardize the operating license that the friars needed to continue their work. So the Brothers of St. John of God did what all intelligent institutions do when they operate in dangerous territory. They kept 2 sets of books. In the reports they sent to the Protomedicato, the body that regulated medical practice in New Spain, the functional equivalent of what would be a health department today, listed the authorized plants, those recognized by European Galenic tradition, those that appeared in Dioscorides with Greek names and classical affiliations. In the internal inventories, those used only within the hospital community, appeared the others, the ones that worked, the ones they had learned from the indigenous assistants, the ones that the indigenous patients who arrived dying at the hospitals immediately recognized and asked for by name in their own languages. To understand what this means, one must understand what the hospitals of the Order of St. John of God were in New Spain. They were not fringe charitable establishments. They were, in many cases, the only organized medical institution in entire cities. John of God, the founder of the order, a Portuguese man named João Cidade, who became a nurse in Granada in the mid-16th century after a spiritual crisis that his contemporaries described as madness and posterity calls enlightenment, had created a hospital model radically different from that of medieval hospices. His hospitals had individual beds, separation of diseases, organized feeding, and nurses with specific training. When the order arrived in New Spain in 1596, it transported this model to a continent where the combination of military conquest, epidemics, and the disruption of indigenous medical systems had created a healthcare need of a magnitude that no pre-existing institution could meet. The Hospital of San Juan de Dios in Mexico City, founded in 1599 in what is now the perimeter of the historic center, treated more than 2,000 patients annually in its heyday. The hospital in Puebla, founded in 1600, had a pharmacy that the Royal Board of Physicians visited and inspected at least 6 times during the 17th century, and 4 of the inspection records are preserved in the General Archive of the nation. The hospital in Oaxaca, more modest but equally active, received Zapotec, Mije, and Mixtec patients who came to the city from the surrounding valleys and whose diagnoses the nurses recorded using a combination of Galenic terminology and transliterated indigenous nomenclature that is now a first-rate ethnobotanical source for any researcher with the patience to decipher 17th-century orthography. The medicinal gardens of those hospitals were deliberately planned spaces. They were not ornamental gardens or vegetable plots for self-sufficiency, although they partially fulfilled that function. They were laboratories for pharmaceutical production. Every plant had a purpose. The friars cultivated what they needed for the preparations they used, and what they cultivated was determined by the clinical reality of their patients, not by the books they had brought from Spain. Imagine the garden of the hospital of San Juan de Dios in Puebla in the year 1640. It is a rectangular plot of land inside the cloister, with terraces of volcanic stone that organize the space into sections. At one end, the plants that any Spanish apothecary would recognize: rosemary, sage, mint, rue, wormwood, mallow. At the other end, a collection of plants that no European botanist of the time could have identified at first glance. A shrub with dark green leaves and small greenish-yellow flowers. A creeping herb with aromatic leaves that smells of something between anise and damp earth. A shrub with a slender stem and reddish-gray, striated bark. A plant with broad, hairy leaves that the friars refer to in their records by a Nahuatl name that the scribe transcribed 3 times with 3 different spellings. And a vine with white flowers that the indigenous assistants prepared as an infusion and that the hospital's internal recipe book mentions, with a note that says only, "For the ailments of women that we do not name here." That note, which we do not name here, is perhaps the most revealing phrase in the entire file. It is a note of self-imposed censorship. The nurse who wrote it knew perfectly well what the plant did. He knew what indigenous midwives had used it for centuries. He knew it worked. And he consciously decided not to write it down because writing it down could have consequences. This vine is the first of our 5 plants. Botanists know it today as Montanoa tomentosa, although in the 17th century, friars called it something else, and the indigenous women who had taught them to use it called it Zoapatle, which in Nahuatl literally means woman's herb. Zoapatle is a plant with a documented history of use dating back at least to the 14th century in what is now central Mexico. The Cruz Badiano Codex of 1552, the first treatise on indigenous medicine written in Latin characters, mentions it in the context of difficult childbirths. The Florentine Codex of Bernardino de Sahagún, compiled in the following decades, describes its use by Nahua midwives with a precision that astonishes those who read it today. It stimulates uterine contractions, accelerates labor when it has been dangerously prolonged, and stops postpartum hemorrhaging in appropriate concentrations. Sahagún did not understand why it worked. He simply recorded that it worked, with the empirical honesty that makes his work a first-rate scientific source. The Brothers of St. John of God knew all this because their indigenous assistants were, in many cases, midwives or apprentice midwives who had absorbed the knowledge of the Ticatl, the Mexica healers, before the colonial system displaced them. And the friars, who saw women die in prolonged childbirth with a regularity that no European text of the time could help them reduce, learned. They cultivated Zoapatle in their gardens. They used it. And they didn't write it down in the reports they sent to the Protomedicato. The second plant that appears in the hospital records is what the Oaxaca hospital records call hierba del manso, gentle herb, a likely transliteration of a name in a Zapotec language that is no longer spoken. Its botanical identification is more uncertain than that of Zoapatle, but researchers from the Institute of Biology at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM, who have worked with the Oaxacan hospital archives, propose that the hierba del manso in the inventories probably corresponds to the plant now known as Anemopsis californica, or to one of its varieties distributed in the semi-arid valleys of southern Mexico. Hierba del manso has anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial properties documented in modern studies, and in the colonial hospital context, its most likely use was the treatment of wound infections, the number one health problem in any hospital before the antibiotic era. What's interesting about the Oaxacan records isn't just that the herb of the gentle plant appears in the inventory, it's that it appears with a quantity notation that allows us to infer the scale of its use. In the pharmacy inventory of 1683, the Oaxaca hospital lists 27 pounds of dried herb of the gentle plant among its stock. To put that in perspective, the inventory of the same year lists 9 pounds of sarsaparilla root, a remedy widely recognized by European medicine at the time, 6 pounds of china bark, the colonial name for quinine, which was already famous in Europe, and 3 pounds of contraierba root. The herb of the gentle plant was 3 times the quantity of any other product in the inventory. That's not a marginal or experimental use, that's the cornerstone of the pharmacy. The third plant is chuchupate. Its name is a transliteration of the Nahuatl word tzitsupati, which roughly means owl medicine, and botanists today know it as Ligusticum porteri, a plant in the Apiaceae family that grows in the coniferous forests of the mountains of northern Mexico and the southwestern United States. Chuchupate has a history of medicinal use among the Raramuri, Huichol, and Tarahumara peoples that stretches back centuries and covers an extraordinarily wide range of applications: analgesic, anti-inflammatory, treatment for respiratory infections, digestive regulator, and remedy for joint pain. How did a plant from the northern mountains end up in the inventories of a hospital in Puebla or Mexico City? Through the medicinal plant trade networks that existed in New Spain and that the friars knew intimately. The open-air markets of Mexico City, where products from all over Mesoamerica circulated, were direct sources of supplies for hospital pharmacies. A nurse who needed chuchupate could buy it at the Tlatelolco market from a merchant who had brought it from the northern mountains, just as today someone might buy herbs from Oaxaca or Guerrero at a Mexico City market. The records of the Hospital of San Juan de Dios in Mexico City list it in 6 different inventories between 1630 and 1720, always under the same Nahuatl name, never with a Latin name, never with an explanation of its origin that might raise uncomfortable questions. The friars knew that chuchupate was a plant used in rituals by several northern peoples, burned in ceremonies, and used for spiritual cleansings as well as for medicinal purposes. This dual nature, medicinal and ceremonial, was exactly the kind of ambiguity that the tribunal of the Holy Office could interpret in the most inconvenient way possible. So the inventories simply listed it, without glosses, without explanations. One line, one name, one quantity. And the knowledge of its uses remained in the oral tradition of the nurses who used it. The fourth plant is listed in hospital records as three-ribbed tree, a name that most likely refers to the plant botanists today call Colubrina gregii, or a related species of the genus Colubrina. The common name refers to the cross-section of the stem, which has 3 pronounced longitudinal ribs or ridges that make the branch appear triangular when cut. It is a shrub from semi-arid regions, with bitter bark and a resin that hospital records associate with treatments for liver and gallbladder ailments. The friars of the Guadalajara hospital mention it in at least 3 17th-century documents, always in the context of patients with jaundice, the yellowing of the skin and eyes that indicates liver dysfunction, and always with the note that the treatment had been recommended by the knowledgeable Indians of the region, a phrase the friars used to refer to the local healers without naming them directly, probably to protect them from potential lawsuits. Jaundice was a common ailment in colonial hospitals, exacerbated by poor water quality, parasitic infections, and viral liver diseases, all of which were facilitated by the urban concentration of New Spain. European medicine of the time had little to offer. Galenic texts recommended purges, bloodletting, and restrictive diets that, in most cases, worsened the patient's condition rather than improving it. The three-ribbed stick, with its effects on the biliary system, effects that contemporary research has only recently begun to explore, was likely a more effective alternative than what the authoritative books prescribed. And the friars knew this, either because they saw it work, or because when it didn't work, they knew that too, and adjusted the dosages with the empirical logic of any clinical observer working with real patients. The fifth plant is the most difficult to trace, and in some ways, the most fascinating of the five. Hospital archives in Oaxaca and Puebla mention it as xonequi, an approximate transliteration of a Zapotec or Mixtec term that has not been definitively identified in existing colonial dictionaries. Researchers at the Center for Research and Advanced Studies of the National Polytechnic Institute have proposed, based on morphological descriptions in two of the inventories, that the friars' xonequi could correspond to Ipomoea muricoides, a vine species in the same family as the wild sweet potato, popularly known in Oaxaca as palo bobo. But this identification is tentative. To date, the xonequi of the hospital archives remains a name without a definitively assigned botanical plant. And that, in a way, is the most accurate metaphor for everything we're talking about. 5 plants that the friars knew, used, and cultivated. 5 plants that appear in the archives but not in official literature. 5 plants whose names in indigenous languages reached the colonial inventories transliterated by hands that couldn't write those languages, in an institutional context that discouraged asking too many questions about their origin and who had taught them. We must be precise about something that is easy to distort when telling this story. The Brothers of St. John of God were not clandestine heroes of an ethno-botanical resistance movement. They were friars of a religious order that operated within the colonial system and benefited from it. They had their own prejudices, their own limitations, and their own contradictions. They hired indigenous assistants but did not consider them equals. They absorbed indigenous knowledge, but did not always attribute it to those who had generated it. When the Inquisition investigated an indigenous healer, the order's hospitals did not necessarily come to their defense. What they did was simply what institutions that have to function under real conditions do: adapt, use what worked, remain silent about what could cause problems, and leave in the archives, for those with the patience to search them, the traces of knowledge that the official system preferred not to acknowledge. The Franciscan collection at the General Archive of the Nation, which includes documentation from various mendicant orders, not just Franciscans despite the collection's name, contains over 4,000 folios in the hospital section related to the medical management of the hospitals of St. John of God in New Spain. Of these 4,000 folios, fewer than 400 have been the subject of systematic study in doctoral dissertations or academic articles. The remaining 3,600 await further investigation. The General Archive of the Indies in Seville has its own body of American hospital documentation, also only partially explored. There is a complete doctoral dissertation, or several, in those unopened boxes. Existing research on the hospitals of St. John of God in New Spain has focused almost exclusively on their institutional history, how they were founded, how they were financed, how many beds they had, and their relationship with civil and ecclesiastical authorities. The specific medical history of what they treated and with what they treated patients has garnered far less interest from historians. Exceptions are few but valuable. The work of historian Luz María Hernández Sáenz on the Royal Board of Physicians of New Spain, published between the 1990s and the first decade of this century, includes analyses of hospital pharmacy inventories that reveal the discrepancy between what the hospitals declared to the Royal Board and what their internal inventories recorded. It is in this space, between what was declared and what was recorded, that our 5 floors reside. The deepest irony of this story is not that the knowledge was suppressed. It's that it wasn't completely suppressed. It was there, in the archives, available to anyone who wanted to look for it. What existed for centuries was an unwillingness to look at it with the right eyes. Historians studying colonial hospitals were looking for institutional history. Botanists studying Mexican medicinal plants were looking for contemporary indigenous ethnobotany. No one, or almost no one, was looking in the pharmacy inventories of a 17th-century religious order for the connection between the two. That connection is what makes the story of the 5 secret gardens of San Juan de Dios, at its core, a story about how knowledge survives. Not in the books written about it, not in the institutions that acknowledge it, but in the side records, in second-hand inventories, in the archives no one consults, in the marginal notes of documents that say, with that formula we already mentioned, that we do not name here. Because naming it would have been dangerous. And not naming it was, paradoxically, the only way to preserve it. 400 years later, the name is in the archives. The plant still grows in the valleys where it always grew, and the knowledge of its uses lives on in the memories of people who never needed an apothecary inventory to know what the friars learned in their gardens and were afraid to write down. The science that confirms what the friars kept silent about didn't arrive all at once, nor from a single laboratory. It arrived like most rediscoveries in ethnobotany, in a fragmented way, from different countries and different disciplines, with decades between one finding and the next, until at some point, someone had enough perspective to see that all the fragments formed the same picture. Let's start with the Zoapatle, because its case is the most documented and the most revealing of how the process of scientific validation of ancestral knowledge works. In 1974, Mexican researcher Alfredo Bot of the National Institute of Cardiology published the first pharmacological data on extracts of Montanoa tomentosa in the Bulletin of the Institute of Medical and Biological Studies of the National Autonomous University of Mexico. His findings confirmed, with the precision of analytical chemistry at the time, what Sahagún had recorded 4 centuries earlier. Aqueous extracts of Zoapatle contained compounds with oxytocic activity, compounds that stimulate uterine muscle contraction through mechanisms similar, though not identical, to those of human oxytocin. Oxytocin is the hormone that triggers and regulates labor. A compound that mimics its action in the uterus is precisely what indigenous midwives had described for centuries when they said that Zoapatle hastened childbirth. That first study was followed by others. In 1981, Alfredo Pérez Medina's research group in the Department of Pharmacology at the National Autonomous University of Mexico identified the main compound responsible for this activity, a sesquiterpene lactone called zoapatinol, a name given in direct honor of the plant's Nahuatl name. Zoapatinol and 2 related compounds, montanol and isocomine, showed activity on uterine smooth muscle in animal models that the researchers described as pronounced and reproducible. In the concise language of scientific articles, such adjectives are equivalent to saying, "This works." But the Zoapatle case also has a dark side that honest history cannot omit. In 1983, the Journal of Ethnopharmacology published a clinical study conducted at the General Hospital of Mexico with women at term who had consumed Zoapatle preparations as a labor inducer. The results showed that the plant did indeed induce contractions. They also showed that in some patients, the intensity of the contractions was difficult to control, that there were cases of fetal distress, and that the variability among herbal preparations made the active dose unpredictable. The study's conclusion was not that Zoapatle didn't work. It was that it worked in a way that required dosage control, which the homemade preparation did not guarantee. That is precisely what experienced midwives knew. The difference between a successful birth and an obstetric complication with Zoapatle was the difference between a midwife who had been using the plant for 20 years and someone who had used it twice. The problem wasn't the plant itself. It was the loss of the knowledge transmission systems that made it possible to use it correctly. When that knowledge is fragmented, as it was with the destruction of indigenous medical systems during the colonial period, and as it was fragmented again with the forced medicalization of childbirth in the 20th century, what remains is the plant without the practice that made it safe. The compounds isolated from Zoapatle remain the subject of active research. An article published in the journal Phytomedicine in 2018 by a team from the Department of Physiology at the Benemérita Universidad Autónoma de Puebla reviewed the mechanisms of action of Zoapatle sesquiterpene lactones on uterine tissue and found that they act by modulating calcium channels in smooth muscle cells, a different mechanism than that of oxytocin. This suggests that the plant could have applications in contexts where conventional labor inducers are not indicated. The research is not conclusive, but neither is it closed. For the herb known as Anemopsis californica, whose tentative identification as such is still debated by botanists, modern scientific research comes primarily from the United States and Mexico, and its geographical focus is itself revealing. The plant grows in the Colorado River Basin and in the semi-arid valleys of northern Mexico and southern California, and the most robust studies on it come from the University of Arizona, the Autonomous University of Chihuahua, and the Northwest Biological Research Center. An article published in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology in 2011 by researchers from the University of Arizona analyzed extracts of Anemopsis californica against multiple strains of pathogenic bacteria and fungi, finding significant inhibitory activity against Staphylococcus aureus, Candida albicans, and Helicobacter pylori. This last finding is of particular interest. Helicobacter pylori is the bacterium responsible for most gastric ulcers, and its resistance to conventional antibiotics is a growing problem in contemporary medicine. The compound primarily responsible for this activity is methyl-eugenol, a phenylpropanoid present in the plant's leaves and roots, which also explains the characteristic odor that colonial hospital records described as similar to celery but more pungent. This odor, recognized by nurses in Oaxaca, allowed them to identify the plant without a Latin name or formal botanical description. The senses as an emergency taxonomy. A form of knowledge that works in practice even if it has no place in academic treatises. Chuchupate has a more extensive modern scientific literature than the plants mentioned previously, partly because its distribution in the southwestern United States brought it into contact with Anglo-Saxon ethnobotanical research, which flourished from the 1970s onward. The Navajo, Hopi, and Zuni peoples used it for the same purposes as the Rarámuri and Huichol peoples of northern Mexico, and this convergence of use in such distinct cultures is what attracted the attention of researchers. An analysis published in the Journal of Natural Products in 2001 by researchers at the University of Illinois identified more than 30 bioactive compounds in the root extract of Ligusticum porteri, including butyl phthalide, ligustolide, and several related phthalides, compounds with anti-inflammatory, antispasmodic, and central nervous system modulating activity documented in preclinical studies. The activity on the central nervous system is especially interesting because it explains a use that colonial hospital records mention indirectly. Chuchupate as a calming agent for fears of the chest, a colonial formulation for what we might recognize today as states of acute anxiety. Patients arriving at the Juanin hospitals in a state of extreme prostration and agitation, frequently after the collective traumas systematically generated by the colonial system, were treated, according to internal records, with an infusion that the friars called from the owl's wood, which was the approximate Spanish name for chuchupate. That a compound with activity on the central nervous system was part of this treatment is not surprising to any contemporary pharmacologist. But that the friars knew this 400 years ago, without pharmacological theory or chemical analysis, is further proof of the power of accumulated observation. The three-ribbed tree is the plant on which modern research is progressing most slowly, partly because its botanical identification remains a subject of debate. Researchers working with colonial hospital records have proposed several candidates: Colubrina gregii, Rhamnus humboldtiana, and at least 2 other species of the order Rhamnales that exhibit the morphology described in the inventories. What all these candidates have in common is the hepatoprotective activity that ethnopharmacological research has been documenting in them over the past 20 years. An article published in the Latin American and Caribbean Bulletin of Medicinal and Aromatic Plants in 2014 by researchers from the University of Guadalajara reviewed the properties of Colubrina gregii extracts in models of induced liver injury and found a significant reduction in markers of liver damage, transaminase enzymes, in the groups treated with the plant extracts compared to the control groups. That finding has a specific historical resonance. The friars at the hospital in Guadalajara used the three-ribbed stick on patients with jaundice. Jaundice is the visible clinical manifestation of liver damage. The markers of liver damage that we measure today in a blood test were, For 17th century nurses, the yellowing of the skin and eyes and the patient's general condition. The measuring tool was different. The phenomenon they observed was the same. The xonequi, the most mysterious of the five, is also the one most directly connected to the ongoing research. The proposed identification with Ipomea muricoides, the Oaxacan palo bobo, has been explored by researchers at the Institute of Chemistry of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, who published a phytochemical analysis of this species in 2016, identifying several compounds with potential anti-inflammatory and wound-healing activity. If the identification is correct, the friars' xonequi could have been the main component of the preparations that hospital inventories associate with the treatment of sore wounds that are difficult to heal, precisely the type of chronic, infected wounds that constituted one of the most common and most difficult clinical problems to treat in a colonial hospital. The investigation is not closed. The identification is not definitive, but there is a thread that leads from a Zoapatle name, clumsily transliterated in a 1680 pharmacy inventory, to a phytochemical analysis in a Mexico City laboratory in 2016. And that thread, however fine, has not been broken. If you feel there are entire files out there waiting to be read with the right eyes, and there are plenty, subscribe to the channel. Every week we open one of those files and share what's inside. The practical question that arises from all this: where are these plants today, and what can someone do who wants to learn about or use them? Has different answers for each of the five. Of the five, Zoapatle has the most active presence in Mexico's contemporary traditional medicine system. It is sold in the Sonora market in Mexico City under its Nahuatl name, sometimes as herb of the matrix. Matrix in the classical sense of womb, in the form of dried leaves or tincture. The herbalists who sell it recommend it for regulating menstrual cycles and facilitating childbirth, the same indication used by Nahua midwives in the 14th century. The Federal Commission for Protection Against Sanitary Risks classifies it as a plant of restricted use due to its effects on the uterus, meaning that its sale is not prohibited but is subject to warnings. These warnings are reasonable and should be taken seriously. Zoapatle is contraindicated during pregnancy except under the supervision of a healthcare professional experienced in its use. It can interact with synthetic oxytocics such as oxytocin or ergometrine, dangerously potentiating their effects. And in people sensitive to sesquiterpene lactones, it can cause allergic reactions. It is not a plant for careless self-medication. It never has been. The herb known as hierba del manso, gentle herb, is found in northern Mexico. It is regularly sold in the markets of Chihuahua, Sonora, and Baja California, and in Latino communities in the southwestern United States, where it is sold in herbal shops under its Spanish name. Its most widespread use today is for digestive ailments and upper respiratory infections. There are no documented severe contraindications in the available scientific literature for topical use or infusions at moderate doses, but clinical evidence in humans is still limited, and any use during pregnancy or breastfeeding requires prior medical consultation. Chuchupate has a geographically widespread presence in herbal medicine, partly because it is known in various cultures of northern Mexico and the Andean region under different names. In the herbal shops of the Bolivian highlands, it appears under the name Andean sesame or under Quechua names that have also been transliterated with varying spellings. In the markets of La Paz and Cochabamba, street vendors sell it as a remedy for joint and muscle pain, exactly the use documented in colonial hospital records. Research on its drug interactions is in its early stages, but indicates caution in its combined use with anticoagulants due to the activity of some of its phthalides on platelets and in people with a history of seizures due to its activity on the central nervous system. The three-rib tree, Calabrina, has a specific herbal presence in western Mexico, primarily in Jalisco, Michoacán, and Colima, where market vendors recommend it to reduce liver inflammation, a popular formulation that accurately describes the hepatoprotective activity that contemporary research has begun to document. Its use is not specifically regulated in Mexico or any other Spanish-speaking country I am aware of, meaning it is sold without restrictions but also without guarantees of quality or correct botanical identification. If someone wants to use it, the recommendation is to seek it from trusted herbalists who can accurately identify the plant, because the genus Colubrina and its relatives include some species with alkaloids that can be toxic in high doses. The xonequi remains an enigma. It does not appear in herbal markets under that name with any documented regularity. If the identification with the Oaxacan palo bobo is correct, it can be found in the markets of Oaxaca, the Tlacalula market on Sundays, the Etla market, the Benito Juarez market in the city of Oaxaca, under the local Zapotec name or the Spanish palo bobo. But that identification is tentative, and using it based on an uncertain identification would be irresponsible. This is one of the plants that researchers continue to search for, both in archives and in the field. What makes the story of the San Juan de Dios hospitals different from other stories of lost botanical knowledge is not just the drama of institutional secrecy or the archaeological interest of unread archives. It is the human scale of what was lost. This was not theoretical knowledge. These were solutions to real problems for real people. A woman in labor that wouldn't progress, a man with an infected wound that wouldn't heal, a patient with jaundice in a hospital that lacked sulfonamides, antibiotics, and any of the modern medical tools we would take for granted today. The friars of St. John of God found those solutions where they could find them, in the knowledge of the people who had lived in that territory long before any European arrived. And then they had to remain silent about it because the system in which they operated made that knowledge dangerous, not because of its effects on bodies, but because of its implications for beliefs. A plant that the indigenous people had used in religious ceremonies could not, according to the logic of the Inquisition, have legitimate medicinal uses without those uses being tainted by its ritual origin. That logic destroyed a lot. Not everything, but a lot. What survived survived on the margins, in inventories that no one read, in the memories of healers that no one interviewed carefully enough, in gardens that continued to grow even though no one wrote about them. There is something worth mentioning before concluding, and that is the current state of archives. The General Archive of the Nation of Mexico has made significant progress in digitizing its holdings over the last 15 years. Some of the colonial hospital records are already available online through the archive's website, although the classification and index remain incomplete for the most specific documents. The General Archive of the Indies in Seville also has its own digital consultation system with partial access to American documents. Any researcher, academic or independent, who wishes to delve into these collections now has tools that did not exist 20 years ago. The limitation is no longer access. It is the ability to read these documents with the right eyes, which requires combining paleographic knowledge to decipher 17th century writing, knowledge of colonial history to contextualize what is read, and botanical knowledge to identify the plants mentioned by their names in indigenous languages. This combination is not common, but it is not impossible either. And at some Mexican universities, the Faculty of Higher Studies Iztacala of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, the Institute of Historical Research of the same university, and the Department of History of the Ibero-American University, there are researchers working precisely at this intersection. If this story interests you as a researcher or student, these are the places to find people to talk to. If you're interested as a citizen who wants to understand the origins of the knowledge circulating in your city's herbal markets, the names we've mentioned are a starting point. Zoapatle, hierba del manso, chuchupate, palo de tres costillas, xonequi. 5 names. 5 lines in a 17th century pharmacy inventory. 5 fragments of knowledge that survived because no one had the time or the interest to completely destroy it. Share this story if you think it deserves to reach a wider audience. And subscribe to the channel. Next week, we're opening another archive that's been waiting far too long. There's an image I want to end with. It's a garden. Not the garden of the Hospital of San Juan de Dios in Puebla in 1640, although it could be. It's any garden in any Spanish-speaking city where someone decided to plant something that no one in their neighborhood recognizes by its Latin name. A plant they learned about from their grandmother, or from a healer at the market, or from a text they found in a library that no one else had read in years. That plant doesn't know it has a history. It doesn't know that its name was silenced for centuries, nor that its active ingredient now appears in scientific journal articles under names its original growers never uttered. It continues to grow with the same indifference it had before anyone studied it. And in that indifference, in that green and silent stubbornness of continuing to exist without anyone's permission, lies perhaps the only form of continuity that knowledge has when archives close, friars fall silent, and inventories gather dust.